Mr. Durst is present with his lawyers. The people are represented. Our jurors and alternates have returned. You may continue your cross-examination.
Mr. Durst, so the question I'm asking you... Oh, yeah, sorry.
Always something.
Mr. Durst, the question that I'm asking you does not have to do with cold breath or cold body or cold face. I'm asking you, when we were discussing, when I was asking you about those details, you responded as follows: I think you're asking me details of something that I've never experienced. Do you recall saying that?
If that's what I said, that's what I said.
Mr. Durst, can you explain why you responded in that way?
I think I was wondering if a medical examiner would tell me or would take a position that if you put your hand over the mouth and face of a dead person, it might feel like not that their face was cold, but that their breath was cold.
Would you agree, though, Mr. Durst, that by saying, I think you're asking me about details of something that I've never experienced, that somebody could conclude from that that you were saying, I'm testifying about things that did not happen, and that's why I'm getting the details wrong?
Jack argument. Overruled.
I think only a prosecutor would come to that conclusion.
Okay, the way this came up, Mr. Durst, is that we were going through and I was asking you about the issue of when you got in to the house and you found Susan. You would agree that since her face was cold to the touch, correct?
Correct.
Since the blood that you saw was, you described it as black, correct?
I thought I described it as dark, and what I thought about after court yesterday is the bedroom was dark. The shades were pulled in the bedroom. That might have been why it seemed dark to me.
Well, Mr. Durst, wouldn't you agree that the other reason the blood could have seemed black as you described it was because, in fact, it was black because it was old and coagulated? Would you agree that that could also be the reason why you described it that way?
Sure.
And so would you agree that when you combine those two details, the fact that Susan's face was cold enough for you to believe it was cold breath, and that the blood that you saw was black, that would lead you to the conclusion that when you saw Susan, she had been dead for many hours?
I would not come to any conclusion from what you said as to when she died.
Well, just if somebody asked you, Mr. Durst, having come and seen Susan in that condition, and they said to you, Mr. Durst, do you have any idea, did it look like Susan had just been shot, or did it look like she had been in that position for a considerable period of time? What would be your response?
I cannot even begin to think of how I would try to figure out how long Susan had been dead for when I found her body.
Would you agree, Mr. Durst, that you are aware, as you testified today, that it is in your interest to try to make it appear that Susan died as close to the time you found her as possible? Would you agree?
That's the argument. Overruled.
No, I would not agree.
So is it your contention that Susan Berman was killed by somebody who was in the house while you were there or around the time that you got there. Is that your contention?
I said the killer might have been in the house when I arrived.
Would you agree, Mr. Durst, that given your observations about Susan's cold face and the black-looking blood, that if the killer were in the house, it would appear as if they stayed there a long time after they killed her?
I have no idea.
And when you're saying that you believe the killer might have been in the house, are you saying also that you think the killer killed her while you were there?
The killer might have been in the house. I never said anything about the killer killing Susan Berman while I was there.
Mr. Durst, can you explain why it would make sense for the killer to have killed her and then just hung around?
Speculation, call it speculation.
You indicated that you parked outside, correct?
Correct.
And then you came up to the door and you knocked, I think you said, for something like 5 minutes, correct?
Correct.
Well, if the killer was inside, wouldn't the killer have had ample opportunity to leave out the back door before you came in?
I think I said the killer might have still been in the house or the backyard.
So, Mr. Durst, it's also your position, your contention, correct, that the killer removed the tape note from the front door, correct?
I never said that. I don't know what happened to the note on the door, and I don't know if it was held up by tape.
Well, you testified that you believe the note was taped, so can you explain what happened to the note?
I have no idea what happened to the note.
Would you agree that if the note actually existed, that it should have been there when you returned to the door?
How would I have any idea how long the note was supposed to stay up for?
Well, your testimony was the note was there, taped, you believe, when you first entered the house. And then a few minutes later, when you made your second entry, you specifically noticed that the note was gone, correct?
Correct.
Wasn't that an attempt, Mr. Durst, to try and suggest to the jury that the killer had removed the note and was therefore in the house at the time you arrived?
Objection argumentative. Overruled.
No.
You are aware, Mr. Durst, that Susan Berman had the same kind of stamps in her house as the stamp that was on the cadaver note. You're aware of that, correct?
What do you mean a stamp?
Well, you placed a stamp on the cadaver note to mail it, correct? Postage stamp.
Yes, I mailed the cadaver note.
And you are aware, Mr. Durst, that in Susan's house, that police found the same kind of stamps as you put on the cadaver note, correct?
This is the first time I'm being told that.
Sustained,
Under what grounds, Your Honor?
since fact, non-evidence.
Well, Your Honor, the court is, we can put on the detective in rebuttal, so.
You may produce the evidence, confront the witness with the evidence,
All right.
or perhaps it's already,
Okay.
or perhaps there's a stipulation, not sure.
All right. You would agree, Mr. Durst, that you were not wearing gloves at any time you went to the residence, correct?
Correct.
Now, there has been a statement made in this case repeatedly that no evidence is evidence and that there was no physical evidence of your presence in the house. You agree that statement's been made, correct?
Correct.
And would you further agree that the fact that there's no physical evidence that you were in the house, you would agree that doesn't mean anything because you admitted you were in that house and touched things, correct?
Objection, argumentative.
Sustained.
Mr. Durst, did you go in the house and touch numerous items?
Yes.
And you would agree that there's no physical evidence that's been recovered that links you to the house, correct?
Correct.
Would you further agree then that the fact that there is no physical evidence that links you to the house doesn't mean you were not in the house, correct?
Objection,
I was in the
Sustained.
house.
call for a conclusion.
Sustained.
What was the objection, Your Honor? I can't-
It's an argument. Argument. The first facts are sufficient. There's no new
All right.
fact in that.
All right, I want to go back very briefly to your knowledge, Mr. Durst, of whether Susan or not had talked to the police. I want to play, is it RD 519, Tim?
Yes.
I'm going to play RD 519, 315-15.
I'm sorry, exhibit is what number?
Part of 291.
And the objection is
352, it's been gone into ad nauseum.
overruled?
They had not contacted her. They were planning on contacting her. They had never contacted her. Oh, you know what, that might have come out in the, you knew that before I just said it right now because it came out in the show, right? Has that already come out or no? I can't remember what's out in the show. Did you know what I just told you or no? Is that a new piece?
No, I did not know
Yeah.
that they had not contacted.
No, they had not come, they were planning on it. So I'm trying to figure out, why would Susan tell you that if it hadn't happened? I mean, any idea?
If the detectives had not called her,
Yeah.
Mr. Durst, you would agree that when I told you that in fact Susan had never been contacted by the police as she had told you, you were quite surprised, correct?
No, I wasn't surprised at all.
Did you hear yourself say they had not contacted her? Did you hear yourself ask that question? What does that mean?
If the detectives had not called her, I don't see up on the screen what you're referring to.
It says in line, so if we go back up, I'm telling you that did you know that the police had not contacted her? So it says, if you look, I'll read it again.
That
I'm
they
gonna
had
tell you
not
something.
contacted her.
That wasn't true. They had not contacted her. They were planning on contacting her. They had never contacted her. And then I say, did you know what I just told you or no? And you respond, no, I did not know that they had not contacted her.
I still don't know that they had not contacted her.
Well, Mr. Durst, your comment in this clip, you would agree the words that you said and the way that you said them, you were communicating that you had not known until I told you during that interview that Susan had lied to you about the police contacting her. Is that correct?
During that interview, I did not know if the police had contacted Susan Berman, and I still, to this day, do not know if the police had contacted Susan Berman.
No, but my question is, Mr. Durst, isn't it true that your response during that interview was to say explicitly, no, I didn't know that the police hadn't contacted her, meaning that you had thought prior to me saying that that she had been contacted by the police as she had told you, correct?
Prior to the interview, I had no idea whether the police had contacted Susan Berman. And sitting here today, I have no idea whether or not the police had contacted Susan Berman.
Right. Mr. Durst, are you denying that you got the stamp and the paper and the envelope for the cadaver note at Susan's house?
I don't know where I got the stamp and the envelope.
So you could have gotten them from Susan's house, is that correct?
I could have.
Now, you would agree you gave a pretty detailed recitation of everything that you did, correct? I'm talking about at Susan's. You were pretty detailed, right?
Pretty detailed, whatever pretty detailed means.
Are you agreeing or disagreeing?
I don't know if I should agree or disagree because I do not know what pretty detailed means.
So what I'm asking you is, you would agree that you described step by step what you did from entering the house to leaving the house to thinking about calling 911. You described all that in detail, correct?
If what I said was in detail, then it was in detail. I never characterized what I said.
All right, so Mr. Durst, is there a reason why, given all the details you gave, that you have no memory of making the decision to write the cadaver note at the house and then getting the paper envelope and stamps from Susan's?
I definitely, absolutely did not write the cadaver note in the house.
Now, my question is, though, is if you've said that you might have gotten the paper, the envelope, and the stamp from Susan's house, correct? You might have, is that right?
I do not recall getting a stamp from Susan's house. I do not recall getting a stamp anywhere. And I do not recall where I got the envelope. In the SUV, I had writing paper and a pen.
Did you have an envelope and a stamp in the SUV?
No,
So, Mr. Durst, I want you to assume that the stamps that were inside of Susan's house were the same kind of stamp as you had on the cadaver note. So my question to you would be, could you have gotten the stamp from inside the house?
Objection to the improper hypothetical evidence.
Sustained.
Hypothetical not based on-
Sustained.
Your Honor, we're going to mark item 14 is going to be Susan Berman's appointment book.
No, it's not 14.
Oh, no.
What's the next in order, Your Honor?
325.
So we have an envelope, it's marked item number 4. I'm gonna mark this envelope as People's 325. Removing the contents is a black appointment planner, and inside the appointment planner are 2 books of stamps. I'm removing the 2 books of stamps.
And display the big one.
This is not in evidence, Your Honor.
Right, he's gonna display it to you, and it's gonna be in evidence in a minute, I think.
Is there a sponsor?
We don't, we're not that formal here in California, it's not a sponsor. It's, so you may show them the exhibit, proposed exhibit.
Have we have a sidebar on this, Your Honor?
No, he's gonna display it to the witness and see if he,
So, okay. These 2 books of stamps I removed, should I mark these separately?
I think you can mark, are those?
I took them out of the black book.
Oh, separate from the black book, should you mark
Yeah.
them? Yes, let's make them, right, 325A?
Maybe we have a sidebar.
Your Honor, we're behind on time. We are going to pose it in the sidebar. There's no-
Yeah, no, I don't understand, I'm overruling the objection.
And People's 130 I'm going to put on the screen as well.
Mr. Durst, can you see those two different items, the stamps on one side?
Your Honor, we seriously, we need to have a sidebar about this.
All right, let's go sidebar.
For the record, I'm placing the appointment envelope back in the envelope.
The objection's overruled, subject to a motion to strike if there is not a foundation laid.
The
Subsequent.
objection is foundation.
Yes, subject to a motion to strike, which you may renew.
Mr. Durst, on the left side, you recognize the cadaver note, correct?
Correct,
That's what you sent, correct?
correct,
And obviously, you put the stamp on there at some point, correct?
correct.
And on the right side are stamps from Susan Berman's day planner from her house. Do you see those?
Yes,
Would you agree, Mr. Durst, that they appear to be the same kind of stamp?
yes,
So my question to you is when you say you do not remember getting the stamp from Susan Berman's house, are you saying, you know what, I'm pretty sure I didn't get it there, or are you saying, you know what, I have no idea, I could have gotten in there, I just don't remember? Which is it?
I never knew up until this minute that the stamps in Susan Berman's house were the same kind of stamp that I put on the cadaver note. I don't remember taking a stamp from Susan Berman's house. I also don't remember getting a stamp anyplace else.
So is it fair to say then that when you look at this, you easily could have taken a stamp from Susan's house?
It's possible.
Okay. All right, I want to talk specifically about the cadaver note. You have now conceded, obviously, that you are the author of the cadaver note, correct?
Correct.
For 20 years, though, you adamantly denied writing the note, correct?
For 20 years, I denied writing it.
You denied that during interviews with Andrew Jarecki, correct?
Correct.
But you did also state, in addition to denying it, have you repeatedly stated, Mr. Durst, that whoever wrote the cadaver note had to be Susan's killer?
I said that to Andrew.
And, Mr. Durst, were you definitive in what you said about it?
I don't know what you mean, was I definitive?
RD 025, 121310, page 681, line 14 to page 682, line 8.
Part of People's 269. 261? 269. 269, this book.
Go to her house.
Can we start it over? We didn't get to the beginning.
I mean, first of all, somebody had a plan to do this, they had to go to her house, do what they did. I mean, if I was gonna rob somebody or burglarize a house, I wouldn't, if they betted Susie, then they wouldn't have picked Susie, because there was nothing there of value. I mean, I assume her jewelry was there, I have no idea if she hid it, but that's the wrong house to burglarize. And now you're taking this big risk.
What's the risk?
What?
Which big risk?
You're writing a note to the police that only the killer could have written. So, I just, somebody would have to be, my rabbi, although I don't see him getting involved in any kind of a killing, he might feel that it's that important that it'd be buried right away, but I think you gotta be pretty Jewish, religious to feel that way.
That's what you said, correct, Mr. Durst?
That's what I said.
And at the time that you were saying to Andrew Jarecki that it was a note that only the killer could have written, you knew while you were saying that you had written it, correct?
Correct.
And Mr. Durst, you also pointed out that the killer, you have to be pretty religious to feel that it's that important that Susan be buried right away. Do you recall saying that?
Yeah.
And Mr. Durst, you were saying that because you were aware that you're Jewish, correct? You're Jewish, correct, Mr. Durst?
Correct.
And Susan Berman is Jewish, correct?
Correct.
And you were aware that under Jewish tradition, the body has to be buried very quickly after death, correct?
Correct.
And you would have known that that would have been important to Susie, correct?
Susan wasn't that religious, so I don't know.
Well, Mr. Durst, when you say Susan is not that religious, in your experience growing up with many Jewish people who are religious, unreligious, etc., wouldn't you agree that most Jewish people that you know, when they die, they are buried within a very short time of their death? Isn't that your experience?
No.
Well, Mr. Durst, you are someone who has expressed an interest in the Jewish religion, correct?
Correct.
And it would be important for you that Susan was buried according to Jewish tradition near the time that she was killed, correct?
Correct.
And Mr. Durst, you mentioned to Andrew Jarecki, you're the one who brought up the idea, correct, Mr. Durst, that this was a note that only the killer could have written, correct?
I think he brought it up with me.
Well, you would agree in this clip, Mr. Durst, you are explaining, first of all, in this clip, and you agree, Mr. Durst, that none of the footage, you've already stipulated that none of the footage from Andrew Jarecki and Mark Smerling that we've shown to this jury, you're aware that we've stipulated, both sides, that none of it is edited, correct? You're aware of that, correct?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Your Honor, will the court, I think
You stipulated, the jury will receive the stipulation.
at this point, Your Honor, I'm going to
It's
ask
in
the
evidence.
court to just instruct the jury of that stipulation.
No, it's evidence. I'm
Okay.
not going to focus
All
on
right.
any particular evidence.
All right.
They'll receive it.
Okay. Mr. Durst, there has been a stipulation by your lawyers, signed by both sides, that you have stipulated that, in fact, the recordings that have been played in this trial, that all of them are unedited. Are you aware of that?
All of the conversations I had with Andrew Jarecki were not recorded.
No, so we're only talking about, Mr. Durst, we're only talking about the recorded conversations.
I'm saying I had conversations with Andrew Jarecki that were not recorded.
There's no stipulation about unrecorded conversations, Mr. Durst, other than what's been entered. What I'm saying to you is, do you agree? I just played you a clip that had your voice and Andrew Jarecki speaking, and you would agree that clip is unedited, correct? That's what you said and that's what he said, correct?
I accept that it's unedited.
Okay, and in that clip, you were discussing that nobody would rob Susie because she didn't have anything. And then you yourself brought up, you said, and they're taking a big risk, correct?
This was at Andrew's urging.
This is your interview with Andrew, December 13, 2010. You said, quote, "and now you're taking this big risk." That's what you said, correct?
That is what I said.
And then you were asked, "what's the risk?" And you said, quote, "writing a note to the police that only the killer could have written." Those were your words, correct?
Those were my words, which I said at Andrew's instigation.
Okay, so you also then mentioned immediately after that, the next line is, somebody would have to be my rabbi, although I don't see him getting involved in any kind of a killing. He might feel it's that important that it be buried right away. But I think you've got to be pretty Jewish religious to feel that way. You said that, correct?
Is that a quote from what? If that's a quote that the stipulation referred to, then that's correct, but I don't recall that.
Well, that's the clip I just played for you a moment ago. I just read, that's the same clip I played. You heard the clip I played a moment ago.
Sort of.
Well, do you need me to play it again?
Sure, play it again.
Okay.
I mean, first of all, somebody had a plan to do this, they had to go to her house, do what they did. I mean, if I was gonna rob somebody or burglarize a house, I wouldn't, if actually they vetted Susie's and they wouldn't have picked Susie because there was nothing there of value. I mean, I assume her jewelry was there. I have no idea if she hid it, but that's the wrong house to burglarize. And now you're taking this big risk.
What's the risk?
Huh?
Which big risk?
You're writing a note to the police that only the killer could have written. So, I just, somebody would have to be my rabbi, although I don't see him getting involved in any kind of killing. He might feel that it's that important that it be buried right away. But I think you've got to be pretty Jewish, religious to feel that way.
That's what you said, correct?
That's what I said.
And you would agree, the second part of it, talking about that the person who sent it and relating that to wanting Susan to be buried right away, that was you actually admitting to something that was true, correct?
That was actually admitting to something that was true. I don't know what I was admitting was true.
What you were admitting, Mr. Durst, that the reason that you sent the cadaver note is that you wanted Susan's body recovered, correct?
Correct.
But Mr. Durst, you are disputing the idea that the first statement that you made, that it was a note that only the killer could have written, you're admitting that you said that, but you're now saying that isn't true. Is that correct?
I'm saying I made that statement because Andrew Jarecki asked me to make that statement.
Well, Mr. Durst, isn't it true that you said the same thing during your 2015 interview in New Orleans with me?
I don't know what I have no knowledge of saying what I told Andrew in 2010 being what I told you in 2015.
Isn't it true, Mr. Durst, that in 2015 you agreed that whoever sent the note had to be involved in Susan's killing, but you said there could have been two people? Do you recall that?
I remember that discussion.
Right. RD 372, 31515, page 89, lines 10 through 24.
Part of 291.
First of all, you agree, as you sit here today, you agree that whoever wrote that letter, they killed Susan. Agreed?
You see, I don't know that. I mean, maybe there were two people who killed Susan. It doesn't have to be one person, there could be two people. One person could go into the house to shoot Susan, and the other person could be the driver.
Okay, no, let me, this is what I mean. Whether the person was the shooter or the driver, whoever wrote the note was a part of killing her.
Yes,
You agree, right?
yes.
No question, right?
Whoever wrote that note had to be involved in Susan's death.
That's what you said, correct, Mr. Durst?
I told you what you wanted to hear.
So you're saying you said it to Andrew because he told you to say it, and you said it to me. Is this a part of your plea bargaining discussions?
Correct.
Well, Mr. Durst, if it's a part of your plea bargaining discussions, and you're saying that whoever wrote the note had to be involved in Susan's death, if it's a part of plea bargaining discussions, wouldn't you have to tell me I'm the one who wrote the note?
If we were going to actually do a plea bargain, I'm sure it would have come up and I would have been asked to sign something.
Okay. Again, well, isn't it true, Mr. Durst, that as you are making these statements, both times, you're saying a note that only the killer could have written, that you are saying this, Mr. Durst, because you knew that, in fact, that was a note written by the killer. Isn't that why you said that?
I did not know it was a note written by the killer.
I'm sorry.
Let me look again. I don't think so. Look at it written here saying this. Did you know that was a note written by the killer? You said that. Argumentative overruled.
And, Mr. Durst, isn't it true that the reason that you denied writing the cadaver note for 20 years was because you never imagined that there would ever be compelling evidence that would force you to admit you wrote it, correct?
No, that's not correct.
What did you mean about one person being the shooter and one person being the driver?
I was answering your question.
So, Mr. Durst, again, if you were looking for a plea bargain, what is the story with now two people being involved? Were you just trying to throw me off during the conversation?
I was responding to your saying that only the killer could have written the note. And I said, well, there could have been two people involved.
Mr. Durst, during your 2010 interview with Andrew Jarecki and Mark Smerling, do you recall being asked whether it made sense for people to suspect you of involvement in Susan's murder?
No,
RD 401, 12, 13, 10, page 691, lines 13 through 20.
Part of 260. Part of 269, 269.
That would you,
Oh, sure, I mean, because she was my spokesman, all of a sudden she's dead right after Janine Piro's doing the investigation. I shut her up.
So, Mr. Durst, you were asked, does it make sense to you that there were people that suspected you? And your response was, oh, sure, I mean, maybe because she was my spokesman and all of a sudden she's dead right after Janine Pirro's doing the investigation of me, that I shut her up. That's what you said, correct?
Correct.
And you would agree that that motive would be the same motive that I asked you about earlier this morning about Susan Berman potentially talking to Janine Pirro, correct?
You asked about Susan Berman being interviewed by Janine Pirro, and I said if Janine Pirro interviewed Susan, she would find that Susan was not credible.
Well, Mr. Durst, but you agree that you were asked if it made sense to you that people suspected you of Susan's murder, and your response was that, yeah, that makes sense because she was my spokesperson. All of a sudden, she's dead right after Janine Pirro is doing the investigation of me, that I shut her up. That's what you said, correct? Those are your words.
Correct.
So aren't you, Mr. Durst, in that statement, aren't you, to Andrew directly, saying during this phone call of June 12, 2015, strike that, that's an incorrect date. During that phone call, aren't you saying that's exactly what occurred? That in fact, you shut Susan Berman up because she had information and you were afraid of Janine Pirro. Isn't that what you're saying in that exchange with Andrew Jarecki?
No.
All right. I want to talk for a moment about this plan to have Susan move in with you. When is the first time that you ever mentioned the plan to have Susan move in with you to your place on Telegraph in San Francisco?
So this would be in 1999. At
And
the end of the year, on a telephone call with Susan, I told Susan that she was right, that I would get bored in a small town like Humboldt County, and that I had decided to move to San Francisco. And Susan said, "Take me with you. I've got lots of contacts in San Francisco."
did you discuss your plans with anybody other than Susan?
The architect, Mike Yoshida. And I think I told Debbie.
Your wife, Debbie, correct?
I think I told Debbie. I know I told Mike Yoshida. Trying to think, I probably told Diane Boucher the same thing.
Have you spoken to Mike Yoshida to confirm that in fact you told him this information about Susan moving up there with you? Have you had any conversation with Mike Yoshida?
You're asking me if I've told Mike Yoshida or spoken to Mike Yoshida recently?
Yes.
It turns out Mike Yoshida is dead.
And can you describe what information you have about Mike Yoshida being dead?
I was told by our investigator that Mike Yoshida is dead.
When were you told this, Mr. Durst? One moment, Your Honor. Your Honor, I think we have the following. Your Honor, we have the following stipulation. Mr. Chesnoff is going to stipulate that originally Mr. Durst was told by their investigator that Mike Yoshida is dead. He will further stipulate that Mike Yoshida is alive. Is that correct, Mr. President?
There is a dead Mike Yoshida. There was a dead. There was. Yes, we are stipulating, Your Honor. Thank you.
We have one more.
Court accepts that stipulation. Thank you.
Mr. Durst, when was your meeting supposed to be with Mike Yoshida?
Are we talking about back in 2000?
Yes, you had mentioned there was going to be a meeting, I think, up at Big Sur with Mike Yoshida and Susan.
Yes, our plans were to leave Los Angeles on December 27th. Susan's plans and my plans. And to drive up to Big Sur and have dinner with Susan's friends at a restaurant called the Panthy, and then stay overnight in Big Sur at the Big Sur Inn. And then on the morning of the 28th, to drive to San Francisco and meet Mike Yoshida at the townhouse I had bought at 52 Telegraph Place.
And it's your testimony that Mr. Yoshida was aware of these plans, correct?
Correct.
Mr. Durst, I want to go back to the night of December the 22nd when you arrived at the house. The plan was for you and Susan to go over to the Chateau Marmont, correct?
I did not get to Susan's house on December 22nd. I got a migraine headache and I stopped at a motel in Bakersfield.
Right, no, I didn't ask you.
I did not get to Susan's house until the 23rd.
No, but the original plan was for you to get there late on the 22nd. We talked sometime between midnight and 1 a.m., and then to stay at the Chateau Marmont, correct? You were going to pick her up and take her to the Chateau Marmont, correct?
Correct, but when we made our plans, I was intending to leave before 11 a.m.
Right. Given that you were not leaving till 11 a.m., and given your admitted cheapness, how come you didn't call Susan and tell her, hey, you should cancel our very expensive room at the Chateau Marmont for tonight?
Pretty good too. Yesterday.
Yesterday. No, he's making reference to our,
Reservations at Chateau Marmont and all that.
okay, just a moment. You may briefly cover this if
Yes.
it's leading to something else.
Yes, it is. Mr. Durst, how come you didn't have Susan cancel the reservation when you realized you were leaving late? Why didn't you call her and say, hey, Susan? And I'm talking about at 11 a.m., because you knew at that point, you knew how long the drive was, you're not going to get there till midnight. How come you didn't have her cancel it?
I never thought about canceling it.
By the way, what was going to happen to the dogs when you were staying at the Chateau Marmont?
Niles Brenner was going to take care of them, was going to walk them and feed them.
Is that a detail you've ever mentioned
Now,
before?
wait a minute. While we were in Big Sur and the 27th and the 28th, Niles Brenner was going to walk and feed the dogs. While we were staying in Chateau Marmont, I assume Susan intended to walk and feed the dogs.
So the plan was you were going to pick up Susan at midnight, go over to Chateau Marmont, and then she was going to be going back and forth all the way to the Beverly Hills area to feed and let out her 3 dogs. Is that your testimony?
You're making it seem like the Chateau Marmont and Susan's house are hundreds of miles apart. It's a short drive, 5 or 10 minutes, whatever it is.
You think to go from West Hollywood to Beverly Hills during times in the day is a 5-minute drive? Is that
10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever you want. That is what I think Susan was planning on doing.
So your testimony now is there really isn't an answer. You're simply saying that whatever will fit into your narrative, that's what you were going to do. Is that what your last answer meant? Mr. Durst, so what were you going to do with those 3 dogs during the entire trip up to Northern California?
We were going to Northern California the day of the 27th, and Susan was going to get back to Los Angeles in the afternoon of the 28th.
I thought you were meeting with
In the morning.
in the morning. And how was
Yoshida.
and how was she getting back?
She was going to fly.
Well, Mr. Durst, you traditionally almost always buy all of your plane reservations well in advance, correct?
She was going to fly.
And were you paying for her flight, I assume?
I'm sure she would have paid for her own flight.
Are you aware that Susan Berman had money at that time to be paying for flights?
It never came up. We made the plans to drive up, and when we got to San Francisco, we were going to meet at 52 Telegraph Place with Mike Yoshida for 2 hours. She had asked me when she should schedule her flight, and I said any time after 4.
So you remember, sitting here right now, you remember the exact amount of time you were supposed to have your meeting with Mike Yoshida, correct? Is that correct?
We were supposed to meet Mike Yoshida at noon.
And you,
I guess it would be finished in 2 hours, making it 2 p.m. I told Susan she should schedule her flight after 4 p.m. to give her lots of time to get to the airport.
and Susan knew about these plans well in advance, correct?
Yes,
Mr. Durst, are you aware of Susan Berman making any flight reservations to fly from San Francisco to Los Angeles?
I'm not aware that she made reservations or not.
Are you aware of her making any arrangements to have somebody pick her up at the airport?
I was going to drive her to the airport. What she was going to do in Los Angeles, I really did not know.
And you've already testified that this trip up to Big Sur in San Francisco was going to start on what day? When were you leaving?
The the 27th of December.
And where was Susan spending Christmas?
She was meeting friends for New Year's Eve, and she was going to Denny Marcus's for not New Year's Eve, Christmas Eve. And she was meeting Denny Marcus during the day of Christmas.
Would you agree, Mr. Durst, that this new information about Niall Brenner taking care of the dogs has never been mentioned to you, by you? It wasn't mentioned by you in direct examination, correct?
I don't agree. I do not. It wasn't mentioned during direct examination because probably I was not asked during direct examination.
I didn't ask whether you were asked about it. I asked you, have you ever mentioned this story with Niall Brenner until right today sitting on the witness stand?
Well, I might have mentioned it to you in 2015 when you interviewed me.
Well, Mr. Durst, if you had mentioned that in 2015 and you've heard the interview played in court, don't you think you would have heard that being mentioned?
As far as I'm concerned, I might have mentioned it during the interview with you. I don't remember.
Well, Mr. Durst, I want you to assume for a moment that interview was played. You never mentioned Niall Brenner. So can you explain then, did you ever mention it to anybody else?
I'm trying to think of who I would have talked to about that.
If you can confine my question to living individuals who are not attorneys or wives.
The people I'm thinking that I probably mentioned it to, you're going to accuse me of only talking about dead people. I very possibly mentioned it to Diane Boucher.
Okay. What about Danny Cunningham? Did you mention it to him?
Daniel Cunningham.
Daniel Cunningham, okay. Did you mention it to him?
Can't imagine why I would mention that to him.
Did you mention it to Gregory, what's his name? I think that's how you refer to him, Gregory, whatever his name is.
You're taking some detail and acting like it's important.
Oh, Mr. Durst, so you don't believe it's important whether or not you ever mentioned previously this new information about Niall Brenner taking care of the dogs? You think that's unimportant?
I'm not aware that it's new information.
Well, Mr. Durst, would you agree that if in fact this is new information that you've never mentioned before and that it only came up on the witness stand today, would you agree that potentially, Mr. Durst, somebody could arrive at the idea that maybe you're making it up? Would that be a reasonable inference?
Sustained.
One moment. Mr. Durst, we're going to show you Susan's day planner, and we're going to put up various entries, and I want you to look at them.
Object to foundation.
Subject to a motion, Mr. Rankin.
Uh-oh.
Start with
Did I-
27th,
What's that? Go.
December 27th?
No, why don't you start? No, let's do it order.
No, hit the 27th.
Okay, start 27.
And you may attempt to lay out the foundation circumstantially with this witness.
Mr. Durst, you recognize this to be Susan's handwriting, correct?
It might be Susan's handwriting.
Does it look like Susan's handwriting?
It looks like it could be Susan's handwriting.
Is there anything about it that leads you to believe it's not Susan's handwriting?
That's Susan's name and phone number, right?
On the first page, Mr. Durst, do you recognize the name Susan Berman and the phone number? That was her landline, correct?
I think her landline had a different number to it.
Okay. Do you recognize the address? 1527 Benedict Canyon.
1527 Benedict was her address.
And again, does this look like her writing?
I just said it looks like it could be her handwriting.
Your Honor, I believe for the purposes that the court has required, that with the offer of proof, that there is sufficient foundation to proceed.
I expect so. I'll hear a later motion to strike if necessary, but you may proceed.
Okay. Let's talk about December 27th, which is Wednesday.
11 a.m. Tom Patton.
It says 11 a.m. Tom Patton. Do you know who Tom Patton is?
Friend of Susan's.
Well, he was her cousin, correct?
Yes.
David Eisenman at 28.
Do you know who David Eisenman is, Mr. Durst? Do you know who David Eisenman is?
What, are you asking me something about Thursday the 28th?
No. Do you know who David Eisenman is? Do you know who that is?
I recognize the name as someone who was a friend of Susan.
Do you remember, Mr. Durst, he testified in this case? He's her hairdresser. Do you recall? He testified in this trial. Do you remember, Mr. Durst?
No.
You don't remember Susan's hairstylist, David Eisenman, testifying at all?
I did not know he was Susan's hairstyle.
Your Honor.
Now I'm remembering.
Your Honor.
The guy said he made friends with Susan, the
Sorry.
hairstylist.
Apologize.
So is he a hairstylist or a friend? I think they're both reasonable.
Okay.
For the record, the day planner came out of People's 325, and from the day planner on this page, which is open to December 28th, is a business card that I'm gonna just note is in here. David Eisenman Hair Studio says December 28th at 11, and then on the 28th it says 11 David.
Do you see that, Mr. Durst? Do you see that, Mr. Durst?
Yes, I see that.
Would you agree that on the 27th and 28th, according to your testimony, Susan is supposed to be with you up in Big Sur in San Francisco? Is that correct?
We were supposed to leave around noon and meet friends of her for dinner in the Panthy at 8 p.m.
So if
Then
you
we were going to go to the Big Sur Inn.
right, going back to the 27th, you can see that she has plans. Go back to to 27th, please.
Yes.
She's got plans at 11 a.m. with Tom Patton. Do you see that?
I see that.
Can you explain, Mr. Durst, how it is that she has plans in her planner book on the 27th at 11 a.m. with Tom Patton, and yet you're supposed to be up in Big Sur in San Francisco with her? Can you explain that?
On the 27th at noon, we were going to drive up to Big Sur.
So you're saying that she could have still made her appointment with Tom Patton, is that correct?
For all I know, her appointment with Tom Patty was on the telephone.
Okay, let's go to
How about Christmas?
Yeah, no, let's go back to the 28th for a second. So she's got a hair appointment with David Eisenman on the 28th. Do you see that crossed out at all?
No,
How's she going to make that hair appointment on the 28th when she's up in San Francisco?
she wasn't going to be able to see David Eisenman.
For the record, on the 29th, there are items crossed off.
Can you see on the 29th?
I'm sorry, on the 28th, will you zoom in? I think I see a notation there on the 28th. Okay, thank you.
On the 29th, Mr. Durst, you would agree that she has items which are difficult to read, but there are things that are crossed out. Do you see that?
Yeah, I see what's up the screen.
And would you agree that that would appear to be, Mr. Durst, an indication that Susan Berman has crossed something out relating to her activities? Would you agree that's what it appears to be?
It appears to be what it is.
Okay, let's go back to the 25th, please.
For the record, it says 25th, Monday, Susie H.
Are you aware that Susan had plans on the 25th to see her friend Susie Harmon?
You saying she's going to see Susan Harmon for Christmas?
Are you aware that Susie Harmon testified as well about plans with Susie Berman on that date? Would you agree?
What Susan told me was that her Christmas plans for the day of Christmas were with Denny Marcus. She said she had Christmas Eve with somebody else whose name I don't remember.
Mr. Durst, we're going to go turn to the 22nd. This is the day that you originally were supposed to meet Susie Berman. Is that correct?
Correct.
For the record, Your Honor, on the 22nd, let me just zoom out. This entire page has entries, sorry, and then the entries have taped Post-its over them, so there'll be entries under the Post-its. I'm calling them Post-its. They're actually pieces of paper taped on there. And so there's entries, original entries.
Anticipating the invention of Post-its?
Exactly. So just to describe for the record, so on the 22nd, there are entries underneath this white piece of paper, and then there's a piece of paper taped over those entries with new entries marked.
And Mr. Durst, I'm not going to go through everything on the 22nd, but it says at 4:30, it says Rich Markey. Would you agree? Would you agree? Would you agree, Mr. Durst?
I don't see Markey.
Talking right here. Mr.
That's
Durst.
Markey. Well, if that's Markey, that's Markey. It doesn't read like Markey to me.
So, Mr. Durst, there also is a notation that says call Ellen right below it, looks like. Do you see that?
Do you see that? I don't see that. That looks like call Ellen.
Yes, that's what I said. Do you see any notation on the 22nd, Mr. Durst, that references you? Let me lift up the post. Yeah.
I can't read the stuff that's crossed out. I do not specifically see anything describing the fact that I was going to arrive that evening.
It appears to say glasses and coat. Would you agree? And then it mentions some names, including Tom. You would agree it does not appear to have anything about either Bobby Durst or the Chateau Marmont, correct?
It does not say Robert Durst.
Okay.
Let's go underneath the Post-it.
Underneath, would you agree that underneath the Post-it, Mr. Durst, on the same date, it has nothing about any plans with you or anything about the Chateau Marmont, correct?
It doesn't say anything about me.
Sometimes it does say Bobby, 31st. So if we go to the 31st, Mr. Durst, do you see where it says call Bobby?
It says call Bobby.
Right, and that would appear, you would agree, you are that Bobby, correct?
I don't know if she had a friend she called Bobby. She definitely called me Bobby.
And you are aware, Mr. Durst, that Susan had a tradition of calling you to wish you a Happy New Year's, is that correct?
No.
We're going to show you the 23rd, Mr. Durst. This is when you are supposed to be on a staycation with Susan, is that correct? Is that right? Is that right?
What we were supposed to do was go to the Rose Cafe for breakfast.
But this is when the staycation started, correct?
I'm not sure whether I'm talking. What your question is. Are we talking about what we planned on doing or what we actually ended up changing our plans when I did not get to Los Angeles on the 22nd, but did not arrive until the 23rd?
Well, you
Our
can
initial plans were.
Would you agree that the 23rd, what we can see here is glasses, and there is nothing, we don't see any Disneyland or Chateau Marmont or Catalina. Would you agree?
Groceries.
We can see GROC, which would appear to stand for groceries, correct? And then underneath,
Doctor someone.
we have something about a doctor, but you would agree nothing about a staycation or the Chateau Marmont or you, correct?
Rob Cohen.
The name Rob Cohen is down there. Is that somebody associated with your staycation stay?
It's very hard to read. I do not specifically see Chateau Marmont.
Okay, let's go to the 24th.
11:30 Cuckoo.
We have 11:30 Cuckoo. Maybe that's Kookaroo. A fine restaurant that's no longer with us.
We'll stipulate.
I wish it were still here. Delicious chicken. You would agree nothing about the Chateau Marmont and nothing about any staycation with Susan, correct?
I do not see anything specific about our plans for the staycation.
And underneath, Mr. Durst, would you agree that, again, nothing about Chateau Marmont or a staycation or you, correct?
I see nothing about Chateau Marmont.
It
Or any
mentions,
of the things we were going to do for the 4 days we were gonna have a staycation.
you would agree that it appears that Susan Berman will put in her day planner some pretty mundane things, correct? Is that correct?
Susan would definitely put in her planner some things. I sort of doubt she put in her planner everything.
And you would agree that the more you're looking at it, you would agree it appears to be Susan's handwriting, correct?
I've already said it looks like her handwriting.
Well, and then I asked you, Mr. Durst, is there anything about the handwriting that leads you to believe that it is not Susan's writing?
Isn't this a question for the handwriting expert?
Well, if you remember,
How can I
Mr.
say it's not her handwriting when I've already said it might be her handwriting?
That's not my question. My question, Mr. Durst, is does it appear to you, not being a handwriting expert, that it looks like Susan Berman's handwriting?
Oh, I don't know what your question is.
You don't know my question is. Let me say it as plainly as I can. As a non-expert, which you are allowed to be in California, you can actually give an opinion about somebody's handwriting in California. Does it appear to you, knowing Susan Berman, does that appear to be her handwriting?
I think this is either the third or fourth time I'm going to tell you that it might be Susan Berman's handwriting.
Okay. Let's go to the 28th, Mr. Durst. This is when we should have the meeting with Mike Yoshida and the return flight to Los Angeles, correct?
No, she could not have gone to the hairdresser on the 28th unless they had an appointment at night.
When you would agree, Mr. Durst, that there's also no indication on the 28th that she's meeting with Mike Yoshida, correct? Is that correct?
There's nothing about our staycation on the pages you've shown me.
And would you agree there's also nothing regarding a plane flight back to Los Angeles from San Francisco, agreed?
Correct.
There's nothing about Niall Brenner and the dogs, correct?
Oh, that would have been between her and Niles. I guess she could have put in the planner Niles taking dogs out or something like that.
Well, she says groceries in the planner, correct? You saw that, right?
Grocery?
You saw GROC, a notation. She notates the word gross, which appears to stand for grocery, correct?
She's got the card right there.
She's got, if you look on the 26, she lists the gardener. Do you see that?
I see it says gardener.
And Mr. Durst, would you agree that probably, other than maybe you and maybe some of her friends, the most important things in Susan's life were her 3 dogs?
Susan loved her 3 dogs.
And don't you think, Mr. Durst, that she would have been very careful to make sure and to document that she had made arrangements that her dogs were going to be taken care of?
She told
Close
me
to
Miles
speculation.
Brenner,
Object to form the question.
Overruled.
Susan told me Niles Brenner was going to walk and feed the dogs on the 28th and the 29th.
So, Mr. Durst, can you explain why it is that in Susan's day planner, we see not one entry involving you, the staycation, Big Sur, San Francisco, the Chateau Marmont, or an airline flight during the time when you are supposed to be with her, both in Los Angeles, Big Sur, and San Francisco? Can you explain that?
Susan kept her friends apart. She could have had a separate listing someplace where she listed everything for her staycation.
Before you ask the next question, may I, I'm gonna leave the David Eisman card on the page it was on. I'm gonna close this back up and place it back inside the envelope.
Thank you. And the stamps?
The stamps we marked separately, but they're 25. I should put them back in this envelope too, right?
Yes, please.
I'm sorry, 325.
Yes.
Mr. Durst, is it your testimony that you believe that Susan Berman had a separate planner book purely for your staycation?
I believe that's possible, yes.
Does that sound reasonable to you?
Yes, that sounds reasonable.
What would the objection be, Your Honor?
You said, I'm sorry, repeat it?
Argument.
Yeah, sustain.
Mr. Durst, would you agree that you needed to be able to explain why it was that you were in Los Angeles and had written the cadaver note?
No,
Well, Mr. Durst, you stipulated that you wrote the cadaver note, and you agree that once you stipulated, that meant by necessity that you had found Susan's dead body, correct?
correct.
And that also meant, as soon as you stipulated, that you were admitting to having perjured yourself in your testimony in Galveston, correct?
Correct.
And it also meant that you needed to be able to explain why it was you found yourself at Susan's house with her dead body when you weren't the killer, correct?
I was picking her up to go to the Rose Cafe.
Motion to strike is non-responsive. Mr. Durst, listen to my question. Once you stipulated that you had written the cadaver note, and that meant that you had found her body, as you just testified, you realized that you had to have a reason other than going down there to murder her as to how it was that you had found yourself in Los Angeles on December 23rd after having testified under oath in Galveston that you had never been there, and after having told Andrew Jarecki and myself and detectives that whoever wrote the cadaver note had to be the killer.
Objection. Argument.
Correct?
Overruled?
No, not correct.
Tell me how that's incorrect.
I decided I had to acknowledge writing the cadaver note long before the stipulation you're referring to.
When you say long before, Mr. Durst, you stipulated in December of 2019, a couple of weeks before trial, correct?
Well, I I don't know when you stipulated it.
December 22nd, 2019, Mr. Durst, is what the date on the stipulation says.
I had acknowledged writing the cadaver note long before 2019.
When and to whom had you acknowledged writing the cadaver note long before 2019?
Call for privilege.
Well, aside from his lawyers. Don't answer the question about what you told your lawyers. Did you acknowledge to anyone else?
Anyone other than your attorney, Mr. Durst, who you had acknowledged to writing the cadaver note prior to December of 2019?
Stuart Altman.
So you told this information to Stuart. Was this in an attorney-client relationship, or was this as a friend?
It was to my friend, the attorney, Stuart Altman.
So, Mr. Durst, the judge instructed you not to indicate individuals that you had told who were your attorneys. So, are you saying that you told Stuart Altman this information as your attorney, or are you telling us that you told Stuart Altman as a friend?
I was telling Stuart Altman and asking his advice on what to do because he was my lawyer and because he was a friend.
Well, Mr. Durst, did you understand that the judge just instructed you a moment ago?
Motion to strike denied.
So listen to me. We're not asking, forget about lawyers for a minute. Is there anybody else that you had told about the cadaver note you said a long time before 2019, who other than your attorneys?
Susie Giordano.
When did you tell Susie Giordano that you had written the cadaver note?
Shortly after I was arrested, when she visited me in Louisiana.
You're aware, Mr. Durst, that Susie Giordano testified under oath that you had never told her anything about the cadaver note. Is that correct? You heard that testimony, correct?
I heard the testimony. I don't recall whether she said anything about the cadaver note.
Mr. Durst, is that why you gave this woman $350,000? Because she had that info on you?
No.
It's time for a break, ladies and gentlemen, until 1:30. Do not converse among yourselves or with anyone else on any subject connected with this case. Do not form or express any opinion on the case. 1:30.